Hi, and welcome back to Wandering Wild. Today is Forgotten Friday, and we're going to talk all about the great auk. Okay, so the great auk was a flightless bird in the Alcid family. Now, this family contains your murres, your guillemots, your auklets, your puffins, and your merlets. Now, remember when I told you that you should never see a polar bear and a penguin together because penguins live at the South Pole and polar bears live at the North Pole? Remember that? Well, technically, I guess that's not true because the great auk was actually the original penguin. Now, penguin kind of has some controversy on where that word came from. There's many options, but a lot of people think it came from the Welsh word pen-gwyn, which meant white head. And so this bird had a white head, and it stood on two hind legs, and it swam, it didn't fly, and honestly, it looks a lot like a penguin, doesn't it? Well, this was the first bird that was called a penguin. And then when European explorers went to the south and they saw what we know as penguins, they called them penguins because they looked like the great auk. Now, come to find out, these two aren't actually related. They really have no genetics in common, they just happen to look alike. Now, wonder why that is? Well, in ecology, we have what's called convergent evolution. Now, we're not talking evolution, monkeys to men here. We're really talking adaptation. So over time, animals are going to choose the traits that help them in their environment. So birds that are lighter can fly more easily. So they're going to survive longer to breed, to make more birds that are lighter. That's what adaptation is. And over time, you end up with the perfected species. Now, convergent evolution is when you have two species in seemingly unrelated parts of the globe that have never seen each other, touched each other, could ever breed together, that look almost exactly the same and have some of the exact same characteristics. So one example of this is the sugar glider, which is a marsupial in Australia, and the flying squirrel in North America. They both have patagium between their front legs and back legs that helps them to catch the air as they jump from tree to tree so that they can glide. Now, sugar gliders and flying squirrels, they've never met. The reason they're so similar is because they both live in heavily forested areas, and this patagium actually allows them to better gain food, to get away from predators, and so forth. So over time, they both just developed similar traits. The same thing has happened between penguins and some alcids, like the great auk. Now, they are in cold waters and they need to get fish that they have to swim to get. So, something that's going to be useful for them is a streamlined body that helps them to swim, strong wings, weatherproofing, waterproofing, things like that. And over time, they're going to gain these characteristics, and that's going to help the penguins and some of the alcids, like the great auk, look almost exactly the same, when genetically they're not the same at all. So, long story short, the great auk is not a penguin, but people thought it was. Moving on. Now, the great auk, who this is actually about, was about 33 inches tall and weighed about 11 pounds. Now, their back was mostly black and glossy with a white front. Their heads were small and their wings were small and used for swimming, not flying. Now, the alcid family, with the puffins and the merlets and the guillemots, all of them fly in the water and in the air, except for the great auk, who only flew in the water. Now, these animals were found in the cold North Arctic waters, from Canada to Iceland to Greenland to Ireland and even south to Spain. Now, these birds only went on land to breed, and they actually needed very specific environments in order to breed. They required rocky islands with sloping shorelines with access to the sea. Now, when you need something this specific, it can be very hard to find. And that's not always a good thing when it's involved with how you breed. Not only did they need specific environments, the islands also had to be close to very rich feeding areas, so while they were breeding they could feed. However, these feeding areas could not be too close to the island because that would encourage human fishermen and polar bears, who are two of the main hunters of the great auk. Now, because of all these restrictions, it's believed that even at their height and prime, the great auk only had about 20 breeding populations. And then over time, they grew less and less. And by the late 18th, early 19th century, the breeding populations of the great auk were restricted to only 5 islands. Now, the great auk was never actively observed by scientists, so all that we know about it was really gained either after the fact from specimen or from laymen such as sailors. And for this reason, we don't really know a lot about their behavior. However, we do know a lot about similar species, and so we've kind of drawn some conclusions. For example, we know that the great auk fished and ate in shoals and shallows, where most alcid species do not hunt. And we know they mostly ate caplin and menhaden. Now, the great auk mated for life, like most alcid species, and the female only laid 1 egg a year, and both parents cared for the egg and the young and took turns feeding it. It was often seen that the auk parents would be swimming in the water with their young perched on their back. Now, we lost this animal, like many, due to ourselves. By the 16th century, all breeding colonies along the European side of the Atlantic were lost, and this was mostly due to the hunting of the animal for their down, which was used for pillows. Now, this animal actually got some form of protection in 1553 when Great Britain prohibited the hunting of the great auk. Now, sometimes when something becomes more rare, it becomes more valuable. So when we started to lose our great auk, they actually started to become more desirable, and for this reason, many rich Europeans really desired the eggs of the great auk. And so they wanted to display these eggs and show them off, and for this reason, the animal was hurt then again by the hunting of these eggs, who were brought back to be sold. And so if you're going to mess with anything, you really shouldn't mess with the potential for new generations of a species, which is exactly what was happening here. Now, the last known breeding colony of the great auk was found on Great Auk Rock off the coast of Iceland. Now, the reason this was such a good place for these animals is because it was a volcanic island that was completely surrounded by cliffs, and for this reason, completely inaccessible by humans and polar bears, really. So they were very safe. However, in 1830, that volcano erupted and sunk the island, and so all these birds had to move. Now, the island they moved to was still a very good place, as it was only accessible from one side. But the new loss of animals really scared a lot of scientists, and so the drive for specimens and information increased. And so often sailors were given rewards if they brought back specimens of the great auk for museums and for scientists to study. And for this reason, they declined yet again. At this point, when they moved to this island, there were only about 50 individuals of the species left. Now, we know that 50 individuals is really not enough to bring back a species. However, when people went looking for specimens, they lowered this number even more. The last known breeding pair of the great auk were actually collected to be specimens by a sailor who had no idea he was collecting the last breeding pair, and this was done in July of 1844. Now, unfortunately, we lost the great auk, and we won't ever get to see it again. However, many species of alcid, like the Atlantic puffin and some murres and guillemots, are also in danger because they have very specific breeding habitats, just like the great auk. So we need to take this into account and say, hey, we're not going to let this happen again, and we can do our best to make sure that these habitats are protected and they're not overly hunted, so that these animals will be around for a long time to come. Now, this bird is not completely forgotten, however. The Scientific Journal of the American Ornithologists' Union is called the auk, in remembrance of this great bird. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Forgotten Friday here on Wandering Wild. As always, my sources are found in the description box below. And if you liked what you saw, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And as always, stay wild and never stop wondering.